All right. So Washington has been inaugurated as president. The capital is in New York at the time, right? And so Washington will live in two homes while he's in New York. The first home that he will live in is 3 Cherry Street. It was the home of Samuel Osgood, rented to Washington. Now, Washington was very particular about not abusing his presidential authority as far as his expenses were concerned, right? And again, it goes back to his reputation. And what he quickly found, is that 3 Cherry Street was too small for his household, which of course includes the slaves that were brought along with him to help maintain the household. Okay, so they'll go from 3 Cherry Street to 39 Broadway, which was a much larger residence that was once resided on by the Comte de Moustier, the French minister to the U.S., right? So there are going to be his 2 houses that he's going to live in New York. Now, the one event that happens that I think goes a lot of times often unnoticed is that he is very quickly, he's inaugurated in March of 1789, and within 2 months, well, actually 3 months, by June of 1789, he has contracted a carbuncle, which is sort of like a boil or on his leg, or an infection on sort of his butt, really is where it was, left thigh, that caused an infection. This infection from the carbuncle caused him to run a fever. And there was a thought at some point in June 1789 that Washington was not going to make it. He was going to die. And this is just within 3 months of the presidency, right? It got so bad that they blocked off carriage traffic from the house in front of Cherry Street and brought straw down onto the sidewalk so that you could deaden the footsteps, right? And then finally, this procedure takes place where Dr. Bard is the surgeon, and he has to go in and essentially lance this carbuncle, which was this huge growth on the thigh of George Washington. And Washington is not sedated in any way, and bears the pain and tells the doctor to keep going, get all of it, right? And the surgery eventually saves his life, but I think it's often overlooked that Washington almost died within this time period of very quickly becoming president, right? So the presidency is not in New York for very long, right? Because Alexander Hamilton, who is Washington's Secretary of Treasury, we'll talk about the cabinet in just a second here, or a little while. But Hamilton comes up with this financial plan, right? He's trying to establish a line of credit for this newly formed federal government. And so what he wants to do is the federal government to assume all of the state debts and begin paying those state debts. Southern state governments are opposed to this because they don't have state debts, right? And so why should they be forced to assume the state debts of the northern states, okay? And so there is this dinner that takes place between Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton. And in the Broadway musical, this is the Aaron Burr song, "The Room Where It Happens," right? Burr wants to be in the room where it happens. And essentially what happens during this meeting is that Hamilton gets Jefferson and Madison to agree to Southern support of his financial plan in exchange for moving the national capital, the nation's capital, to a more southern location, which will be right along the banks of the Potomac River, which at this point is swampland. In the meantime, they'll set up shop for a 10-year time period in Philadelphia, making it move a little further south. And so this financial plan is actually a stroke of genius by Alexander Hamilton, because it creates a new national debt, which allows this federal government to establish credit and begin to sort of grow in stature within the governments throughout the world, right? Now they can raise revenue, right? And they'll do that through taxes with whiskey. And we're going to see that there will be opposition to that from whiskey distillers in the West. And this whiskey rebellion, which we'll talk about, I'm going to have you guys do another B. Washington simulation with the whiskey rebellion, so I won't go into too much detail with that, right? So essentially, the capital moves from 1790 to 1800 to Philadelphia. Now, there was a large thought that the capital would stay once it's in Philadelphia. Excuse me. Once it's in Philadelphia, they're not really going to want to move it. So there was movements being made to have Philadelphia become the permanent capital. Right. There was a more expansive president's house that was built, but it does move down to Washington, D.C., and the first president to inhabit the White House is John Adams. And it was by no means a good thing. It was still in sort of an unfinished state. Washington, D.C. was in an unfinished state, kind of apropos for the presidency of John Adams, right? But what you see here is the house that was lived in by George Washington, which when he was president. So essentially this is the White House today, right? This was the house of Robert Morris. And you can see that if you know the historic Philadelphia area, this is the Liberty Bell Pavilion, right? Independence Hall. This is Congress Hall over here. And then on this corner on this side over here would be where the Supreme Court would have met. So essentially you had all three branches of government, Supreme Court over on this side, legislative branch here, and executive branch here. Now, this is Market Street right here. And on the other side of Market would be the Visitor Center. And this would be, this is 6th Street right here, I believe. 5th is over here. 5th, yeah, I think it's 6th, right? And so this would have been the house of that George Washington would have used as he was president, right? Now, as they were sort of, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to make this an open air exhibit. And so what they were doing within the archaeological study is that they found this sort of secret passage underground that went from the house, which out to where the stables would have been. And that's where the slave quarters would have been. So this is all new scholarship that existed as they were trying to do this in the turn of the century, 2000, 2004, right? And so the most ironic of things, right at the doorway to the Liberty Bell, right, which abolitionists in the 1840s would have used as their rallying cry for the freeing of slaves, is where the slave quarters would have been, right? So a new interpretation of this president's house had to be conducted. And so this is the exhibit as we see it today. It's an open air exhibit where you can go in and you sort of are ushered in through the different rooms of the house. And there's monitors on the wall telling stories. There is recognition of the slave quarters. All the names of the slaves are on this wall or on the other side, right? Oney Judge, Martha Washington's body servant, famously escapes while they're here in Philadelphia. Philadelphia in the 1790 to 1800 had a large abolitionist movement taking place, right? And so there was definitely a movement to free as many slaves as they could. So, and there was also a gradual emancipation act in place, and Washington was unaware of it, and he's made aware of it by Edmund Randolph, where if a slave lived continuously in Philadelphia for a 6-month time period, they were free. So Washington starts to cycle his slaves without telling them why out of Philadelphia and back down to Mount Vernon and bring them back again so that they can avoid this 6-month rotation and not be susceptible to the Emancipation Act, Gradual Emancipation Act, right? Sort of a bit of a deceptive move on Washington's part, right? So if we go into the house here, you can see that you would have entered in through the passage here, okay? Family dining room here where Washington would have taken his meals with Martha and Jackie's 2 kids, Nellie and little Washie, as he was called, right? So there's 2 children in here as well with Martha and George. This is the state dining room back here where Washington would have received visitors. And he did so on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you would have gone up to the stairs to the 2nd floor, well, let's continue on the 1st floor before we go up, right? This would have been the kitchen and wash house, and then this would have been that back area, which is this all right here. Is where the Liberty Bell Pavilion starts, and this is where they found the slave quarters, right? So if we go further up, Upstairs, this is the yellow drawing room in front. This is where Martha would have held her teas on Friday afternoons, a much more informal gathering than the levees held in the state dining room, attended by Washington. The state drawing room, which would be above, the carpet in here is said to have inspired the carpet that is in the Senate right now. And then also the other thing too is this bow window. This is supposedly the inspiration for the sort of semicircle that you see as part of the White House as well. The president's room, this is where the cabinet would have met. This is sort of his private office, right? And then you would have had the bedrooms. The two front bedrooms would have been for the two kids, Nellie and Washi, and then their servants would have been there as well. Martha and George would have been back here, okay? And so what's interesting is that part of what I did as my study of my fellowship while I was at Mount Vernon was to take a look at events that happened in each of these rooms and sort of tell the presidency of George Washington through those rooms. So for example, the passage, there's this meeting of Washington with a Native American tribe in which they had this ceremony that was recorded by John Quincy Adams, who was sort of an up-and-coming ambassador at the time and happened to be there and recorded this meeting of a smoking of a peace pipe that took place, right? And so I talk about Native American relations through the passage. In the state dining room, we talk about these levees. And these levees were formal meetings where Washington formally received members of Congress, and they were criticized because they sort of had a monarchical appeal to them, right? And Washington, in his defense, is trying to figure out what this office of the presidency looks like, and he's trying to give it some level of respect. And so these levees were a way to sort of offer the respect to that. And then when we get into the yellow drawing room, we talk about Martha's role as first lady, and the president's room is where the cabinet meets. So we talk about the cabinet there, and then we talk about the slaves within the slave quarters, right? So it's an entire unit of lesson plans on the presidency of George Washington, sort of weaved in with the different rooms in the house. So so those would be where, so Washington's his entire presidency really is going to be in this house of Robert Morris. This is where most of the events of his presidency will take place, okay? So what I want to do next is I'm going to stop this portion of the video here, and then we're going to talk about the cabinet next. And that's a real sort of interesting conversation. There's a video link I have with that as well. So let's go ahead and move on to the next stage.